I'm Shaun McCarthy. I chair the board of the Supply Chain School and I lead the infrastructure group. My job really is just to introduce our expert speaker today. If like me, you were fascinated by the title, Super Amphibian Highways, what's not to like about spending an hour talking about that? But equally, biodiversity is kind of sometimes tends to be the bridesmaid of a topic. Everybody talks about carbon and everybody talks about social value, but actually, the world in which we live is in danger and is threatened. And this is a really, really important topic. So I shan't say any more. I'm going to hand over to Terry. Over to you. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Shaun. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Really pleased to be able to talk to you this morning. As you say, the topic presentation, Super Amphibian Highways. So my name's Terry Wilkinson. I'm from a company called ACO. I'm a civil engineer. I've been with my company for about 10 years now. Prior to joining ACO, I was a highways engineer for local authority highways. So background civil engineer and highways, and talk to you today about a topic that I'm very passionate about. So in the presentation, I'll be looking at biodiversity in and around the highway. As the title suggests, particularly focus around amphibians, but I will kind of touch on other species as well, and look at things like reasons for decline and some of the solutions to help prevent fragmentation, increase genetic diversity, and help achieve biodiversity net gains. So brief agenda of what I'll be covering in the next sort of 45 minutes or so. I'll start off looking at impacts of construction and how urbanisation, fragmentation and climate change is affecting species decline. I'll look at some of the legislation, standards and strategies that we've got in place to protect our natural systems and biodiversity. Then move on to design and mitigation. So within that section, I'll look at some of the solutions, highway solutions that can help to mitigate species decline in and around highways. And although this is sort of big focus around roads and highways, a lot of what I'm saying today will also kind of be valid for other types of sites as well, new housing development and that kind of thing as well. And then I'll finish off looking at some case studies. So really kind of best practices and examples of where some of the different types of solutions that I'm going to talk about have been incorporated to help protect wildlife and prevent road traffic accidents. So just to set the scene, I guess, looking at impacts of construction of infrastructure and transport infrastructure in particular over the past few decades or so, has had major impacts on wildlife populations worldwide, causing habitat loss, pollution and fragmentation. Fragmentation is a real, I'll probably keep coming back to that word, that's a real kind of key issue, particularly in terms of things like highways, the long linear nature of roads cutting across paths and routes for wildlife and species as well. On the graph here, the dotted black line towards the bottom shows or represents percentage of species extinctions that would be expected under a constant standard background rate. You can quickly see in the last sort of couple of hundred years or so, modern extinction rates have risen dramatically higher than what, say, would be expected over a background kind of rate. And this really corresponds and relates directly to the rise of industrial society and impacts that we're having on the world around us. There's kind of lots of different reasons and impacts for this, but I've just kind of picked a few sort of major examples of things over the past 200 or 300 years or so. So we had the first industrial revolution towards the end of the 1700s. 1871, the UK population first exceeded 30 million. See, now it's well over double that. In 1959 in the UK, we had the UK's first full-length motorway open, the M1. And then post-2000, the central England temperature 1 degree warmer than it was sort of in the 1850, 1900. So kind of sort of putting that first slide into context in terms of impacts and things that we've been having on society. In terms of roads in Great Britain, we've got one of the densest road networks in the world, a combined road length somewhere in the region of 247,000 miles, still continuing to grow year on year, an increase of 5,000 miles alone since 1999. Over 80% of land in the country is within a kilometre or so of a road, and road verges comprise somewhere in the region of 1% of land surface in the UK, so it's quite a considerable portion of land. National highways alone, who are responsible for the strategic road network in England, manage somewhere in the region of 30,000 hectares of land green space. So actually makes them one of the biggest land managers in the country. As I said, road systems, because of their long linear nature, regularly kind of cut across wildlife migration routes as well. In terms of figures, there's kind of various reporting means out there. I've just shown an extract here, formerly called Project Splatter. They've recently changed their name to the Road Lab. but they kind of collect and correlate reports of wildlife roadkill that people can log anywhere in the country. Just put an extract up there from a couple of years ago from 2021. They had over 6,000 wildlife roadkill reports on there. I'd say that is a small fraction of the number of species and wildlife that are actually killed on the roads. Obviously, this is just reported incidents. As I say, the actual number for this will be much higher, and I'll touch on a couple of specific statistics in the next couple of slides or so. So kind of put some simplistic representations up there in terms of roads and how they can sort of impact habitats around us. So roads by their very nature responsible for loss and fragmentation of habitats. So that first graphic there in picture A gives a simplistic example. If we build a new road, cutting across and cutting through habitats, you can sort of see the impacts that has. So that's the sort of thing that we need to try and avoid when we're looking at roads, and particularly new road schemes. So the general hierarchy to be followed when looking at schemes is sort of shown there, as I say, quite simplistically in pictures B, C and D. So wherever possible, the first thing is to avoid any impacts on our habitats around us. Often that's not possible or impractical. So where that's not possible, then we need to look at mitigation measures to try to design into the scheme as an integral part of the design. And I'll touch on some of the specific solutions in the kind of the next section of the presentation, but things such as underpasses, overpasses, green bridges, that type of thing that can replace and help that connectivity, and some other solutions as well, which I'll talk about as well. And then as a last resort, we look at compensation. So where we're unable or there's still significant residual impacts from developments, then we look as a last resort at compensation measures. So this is the principle within the mitigation hierarchy, which is the sort of hierarchy that's followed in various guidance, such as Natural England's biodiversity metric. A lot of local authorities and highway authorities will follow this principle as well in their biodiversity guidance. And I'll mention some of that in terms of some of the standards in a few slides' time. So I've said about fragmentation, and I will kind of keep coming back to that. So connectivity of habitats is vital, particularly for amphibians, because even in unfragmented landscapes, amphibian populations can experience difficulties. Amphibians need to be able to move to waterborne areas and landborne areas, which is critical for their survival. So they need bodies of water for breeding, egg laying, and as I say, their development is very much dependent on their ability to move around to these locations. So some of the impacts in terms of roads, say, particularly for amphibians. So habitat loss and reduction in size can mean that populations in those areas are smaller. Where we have increased patch isolation, so say for example, if a disease kills off or drastically reduces a population within a certain site, that isolation kind of prevents the site being recolonized from other individuals, from other populations, so it prevents immigration. That's also going to impact in terms of genetic diversity, so increase the risk of genetic disorders and inbreeding as well. And it can lead to an increase of invasive species. So often those species that are not endemic to the natural habitats are often those that are very much more able to adapt well to quick and rapid changes in environment. So it can actually lead to increase in those types of species as well. So I've mentioned some statistics. I'm just kind of moving aside from amphibians just for a second and give some specific figures. So the UK hedgehog population is estimated dropped around 30% in urban areas since the year 2000. And it's estimated that somewhere in the region of 100,000 hedgehogs are killed on the roads in the UK each year. The dormouse is another prime example of UK species significantly impacted by fragmentation. They tend to spend most of their lives in trees, and they only travel small distances across open ground. So typically they won't cross large roads, for example. And you can see the UK dormouse has suffered around 50% decline in numbers since 1995. So we've had significant loss of woodlands and connecting hedgerows, which is very much vital to their survival as well. Climate change is another significant impact that's affecting biodiversity in various different ways. There's a lot of evidence that demonstrates that the response to wildlife in terms of climate change is often not to adapt to the new climate conditions, but rather to move their distribution range geographically in order to keep within their sort of niche climatic temperatures. So the graphic here just illustrates a specific example of this with different types of species, and it shows both the kind of the expected sort of movement and range shifts, as well as the actual observed range shifts within sort of northern area of the UK. And this spans a period of, I think it's around 1960 to 2000. So interesting to see that reptiles and amphibians in particular, the actual observed range shift is the opposite of what was kind of anticipated and expected. So I'm now going to touch on some of the legislation, standards and strategies that we've got in place. I've listed up there some of the key protective measures that we have in the UK. I'm not going to go into these in any great detail, but I will just touch on a couple of them in the next couple of slides or so. So the first one I want to look at is the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981. We've got 7 native amphibian species in the UK, all of which have some legal protection. So all amphibian species are listed on Schedule 5 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act. And this legislation protects them from things like being sold or offered for sale. So protects them from exploitation in the pet trade and laboratory use and that type of thing as well. The 2 that I've shown on there, we've got the natterjack toad at the top left there and the great crested newt at the bottom. They're also classed as European protected species, and they're further protected under the Conservation of Habitats and Species Regulations 2017, I think it is. So the protection under there makes it an offence to capture, injure, kill or disturb them. And that also protects their eggs, their breeding sites and their resting places as well. We've also got protection for plants. Plants are obviously very important for all the biodiversity and the wildlife around us that lives in and around them. Things like vegetation clearance can impact animal habitats as well, and also an issue for plants as well. There are, I think it's 186 species of plants that are protected in the UK, again listed under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, and they're protected under that from picking being sold under that act as well. Something that we're hearing an awful lot about now in terms of biodiversity net gain. This is something that's now been formally introduced into the planning system through the Environment Act that was passed in 2021. One of the aims of the Act is to help combat environment and climate crisis and really acting as a driver for the government's 25-year environment plan, which I've kind of put a snippet on there as well. So biodiversity net gain, I've put a kind of some text there at the bottom to say that biodiversity net gain is an approach which aims to leave the natural environment in a measurably better state than beforehand. So this has now been kind of formally introduced in the Environment Act. This will be mandatory from later this year. I think it's November of this year. It will be mandatory for all new developments come under planning in England, and also nationally significant infrastructure projects will fall under the scope of this as well. And specifically, it's going to be mandatory for developers and schemes to provide a minimum, so at least 10% of biodiversity net gain in respect of any new development impacting on habitat loss and degradation. So we talk about biodiversity net gain, as I say, it's spoken about quite a lot on this 10%, but what does this 10% actually mean, and how do we measure it and quantify it? So Natural England's biodiversity metric, current version 4.0, this is expected to form the kind of the statutory metric when biodiversity net gain becomes a mandatory requirement. And it really provides a way of measuring and accounting for biodiversity losses and gains resulting in development in a robust and consistent manner. One of the first couple of slides, I sort of spoke about that mitigation hierarchy, and you can see it kind of shown again here in the metrics. So we've got that avoid, so where possible, avoiding any damage, then to minimize, remediate, and then compensate as a last resort. So again, sort of following that hierarchy as well. So the metric itself, it uses habitats, so the places where our wildlife species live, as a way to kind of describe and quantify biodiversity. So these habitats are then converted into measurable biodiversity units, which is then used as the currency of the metric. I'm not going to go into any great detail, but I think it's just important to understand that the outline principle around the metric and how it works. So in order to kind of calculate our 10% value and how we derive that, you first survey your site and you divide it up into distinct parcels of each different type of habitat and the condition of that habitat as well. And you can then use this information to calculate the pre-development units for each habitat site before we look at design. So this is something that needs to be done by a specialist ecologist would undertake this work. I think it's really important that ecologists and engineers in particular need to work very closely together right from the outset on sites to really understand and make sure that we're designing our sites very much with biodiversity in mind. So we take that value, kind of the pre-development value, Then we look at the site and design the site accordingly. And then looking at the design for the site and the plans that we've got in place, we can then calculate the biodiversity unit values for each type of habitat that will be in place kind of after the development. And then basically the difference in the change of the units can then be calculated, and that's where you get your 10%. It's important to note that you need to quantify that 10% within the categories itself. So say different types of categories: woodlands, grasslands, mudflats, rivers and ponds and that sort of thing. And that 10% needs to be considered for that specific type of habitat. So for example, if you're coming along to a new site and let's say, I don't know, you've taken down and removed a load of trees, you couldn't, for example, replace that with, say, a pond, because it's a different type of habitat, and so that 10%, as I say, needs to be considered for that specific type of habitat that we're looking at. In terms of national highways, back when they were Highways England in 2017, they published their first environment strategy. This was a couple of years after Highways England and they were established from the Highways Agency. Within that strategy, it outlined their approach to improving and developing solutions to the environmental challenges, and the aspiration from that strategy was a strategic road network working more harmoniously with its surroundings to deliver an improved environment. National highways as they are now, I think it was last year, they created a new specific division within national highways called the Environmental Sustainability Division. And just this month, I think it was just last week actually, they've published their latest environmental sustainability strategy, which sets out their kind of vision and framework and plans to implement this strategy. And I've put just a couple of extracts up there from it as well. So we've got the kind of the strategy wheel, which I've shown there, which kind of has the vision and the strategic outcomes in the center of the wheel. And then it's broken down to 9 priority areas to focus on the outside there. And in terms of nature, I've just highlighted a couple of the priority areas they've mentioned in this latest environmental strategy. So one in particular, looking at nature-based solutions to help connect habitats and promote biodiversity, and also the importance of partnership working. So working with adjacent landowners and strategic partners, as it says there, to help integrate the network into the kind of the wider natural landscape around it as well. In the last sort of year or so as well, there's been a number of initiatives from National Highways. And again, I've just put a couple of examples up here of some of the things that they've been working on. One of them is their Network for Nature programme. So working in conjunction with the wildlife trusts for, I think it's around £6 million budget for that, for a number of schemes across England to help enhance and restore wildlife habitats alongside the strategic road network. As I say, they're responsible for around 30,000 hectares of green space, so considerable amount of land that can impact on wildlife there. They've also undertaken a green mapping project. I think it was Manchester Metropolitan University they've commissioned to develop a detailed map of all the habitats on their network to enable them to kind of focus and understand what different types of habitats they've got, the conditions and everything else like that. And then using the biodiversity metric tool then enables them to understand where they can kind of prioritize and target their strategies accordingly. So I'm just going to touch now a little bit around design and mitigation on and around the highways. So correct mitigation is going to depend on a number of different factors for individual site circumstances and locations, as well as the different types of species that are in and around those areas, the population numbers and kind of how they disperse and move around those areas. So I put some extracts up there from the one at the front there is National Highways Biodiversity Design Guidance, and also a couple of good examples that I've seen from local authorities, in particular from Gloucestershire and Somerset, in terms of biodiversity manuals. And just touching on that mitigation hierarchy again, so I kind of mentioned it at the start and also sort of showed it in Natural England's biodiversity metric. Also within the design manual for roads and bridges, they talk about, again, design and mitigation and the same sort of hierarchy here. The wording slightly different, but the kind of the principles of it exactly the same. So again, firstly, looking to avoid and prevent any impacts, and where that's not possible, reducing those impacts. And then as a last resort, their remediation. So where it's not possible to avoid or reduce to a significant adverse effect, mitigation measures to be put in place. You'll see similar in other guidance as well. So say, for example, those other 2 local authority documents have similar guidance there too. And as I say, one of the things that's crucial is looking at the particular species in question. So for this example here, and I put an extract up there from the Somerset Highways Biodiversity Manual. So within that, it highlights that surface residues on standard concrete material, for example, that's subject to build up on that type of material, can actually be harmful and fatal to amphibians. So it's important, as I say, to understand the species, understand things like the materials that can be used. So for things like tunnels, for example, amphibian tunnels, then other materials would need to be considered, such as an inert material like polymer concrete, for example, which it references there. And it's also important to kind of consider the mitigation and the system as a whole. So understanding our species, what we've got, the populations, where they're moving to and from, and that can enable us to kind of develop our mitigation solutions, so we can, for example, have underpasses at the right place, and we can guide and direct our wildlife accordingly to those kind of areas as well. That's why I say it's really important that engineers and ecologists working together to understand the importance of that, to enable us to develop strategic solutions that are really going to help our sites. We've also got the SUDS manual, a very comprehensive document, around 1,000 pages, in terms of design, operation, maintenance of sustainable drainage systems. And good SUDS design is built on the 4 pillars. So looking at water quantity and water quality, and then also understanding amenity and biodiversity within that. So historically, in terms of drainage design, water quantity has always kind of been the main focus. We've got water on our site, we need to drain it, get it off our site as quickly as possible. Whereas the philosophy behind SUDS is actually looking at using water as a resource, designing it to be used at source, and we can then really enhance the amenity and biodiversity and improve the water quality of it as well. So chapter 6 within the SUDS manual talks specifically around designing for biodiversity. And within that, it mentions that habitats within any SUDS schemes in particular should link with local and other regional habitats to help build and enhance that connectivity, so reducing that fragmentation. And this can help mitigate problems, as I say, associated with habitat loss that I've kind of outlined at the start there. So now look at some of the types of solutions that we can use on our sites to as I say, to help mitigate against those impacts and provide that connectivity for our wildlife. So a few examples here, we've got things like wildlife tunnels and underpasses. Again, these would need to be designed and tailored specifically for the species in question. We can have tunnels, for example, like the one shown in the center of the picture there, to be kind of installed flush with the road surface. So something like this would have open slots in the top, which allows light into the tunnel, which can have a number of benefits. One is that it encourages the species to use that, so not just in the daytime, but at night time as well. That it just makes it more encouraging for them. The slots also can allow moisture in, so keeping the tunnels nice and moist, so the conditions that are favourable for amphibians in particular. Also keeping the temperature, just so it doesn't get too hot or too cold. So the temperature within the tunnel is the same as the outside temperature as well. And also, the higher up that we can keep our tunnels, typically the shorter that they would need to be. So the shorter they are, the more likely the wildlife is to use them. Also, it's going to be a more cost-effective solution as well. It also mitigates against other risks such as flooding as well, but if we can keep those tunnels higher up. Kind of tied into that, we've got things like guide walls and guide fence, so to direct our wildlife to the relevant crossing points, and other things as well. We've got there like a combined amphibian trap and tunnel, so providing a connection feature, say across side roads for the wildlife to kind of continue their journey through, but also acting as a preventative measure, preventing them from getting onto the road itself. So that particular solution there is designed like a cattle grid for amphibians. It has wide slots in the top that they can't traverse, so prevents them getting onto the main road, and they just safely fall through the slots into that path, and then they can continue on their journey there. We've also got things like temporary fencing. So during a construction phase, if we need to keep wildlife away from those areas, then we can erect temporary fencing just while that's being undertaken. And then obviously once the work is completed, we can remove the fencing. So those sort of solutions there, very much in terms of kind of mitigating against fragmentation. Other sorts of solutions that I've shown here. So I've got a wildlife curb in the bottom left corner there. So if you can see from that image there, it's the same profile as a standard road curb, a half-battered road curb, and it's designed to be placed centrally in front of a road gully. So how this works is, for amphibians in particular, when they come up against a vertical surface, so on a road, for example, if they come up against the curb, their natural inclination is to follow that vertical surface. So typically on a normal road, curbs they're going to follow the road and it's going to direct them towards the gullies. Frequently, they would straight onto the gully grate and often fall into the gully and become trapped. The way this wildlife curb works is you can see in the image there it has a recess within it. So as I say, it's designed to be positioned centrally in front of a road gully. As they approach that recess, they continue to follow that vertical surface. So they move into the recess and it allows them to safely bypass the gully and come out the other side. So when looking at these types of solutions, you need to think about, as I say, the wider landscape as well. So also providing a means for the wildlife to escape from the road. And that could just be as simple as putting some drop curbs in as well. But again, working with ecologists, understanding the movement of the species, we can design those solutions accordingly. Often used in conjunction with this is an escape ladder or mesh. So this is something that can be easily fitted into a standard road gully or retrofitted. And it's basically providing a means for amphibians to climb out of the gully if they have become trapped in. So this can be in the form of a mesh shown there, say easily retrofitted onto the side wall of a gully, or also specific kind of ladders as well can be incorporated into those as a solution too. So I've shown some guide walls earlier in terms of helping to direct and channel wildlife. On a similar vein, something like this, a one-way fence. So as its name suggests, it allows movement in one way. So you can see that kind of curved panel of the fence there. It allows amphibians to be able to climb over that and on the curved side, but it prevents them from coming back the other side as well. If you've got sites where, as I say, you've got amphibians, preventing them maybe from getting onto a road or in an area that we want to keep them away from, but any that have strayed into that area are able to kind of climb away and escape as well. Because it has that curved panel as well, another benefit is when they come up against a vertical surface or a wall or a fence, they will follow that surface. So where they have come up against the fence, following under the fence as well does provide them with a certain degree of protection as well against predators. Other sorts of mitigation solutions, we've got things like wildlife refuges. These can be kind of bespoke refuges, kind of designed specifically with different species in mind, as shown there. Or it could be as simple as things like stacking up dead wood, logs and things like that, particularly for insects and things like that too. On the kind of the larger scale side, and we're starting to see a few of these in the UK as well, it is green bridges. So this is an overpass for wildlife to providing means again of reconnecting those habitats and allowing them to move around without the kind of hazard of them straying onto the highway as well. So I'm now just going to touch on 2 or 3 different case studies where some of these types of solutions have been employed with kind of examples in terms of studies as well. So I think it's important that we understand that the solutions we're putting in place are actually achieving the goal that we want them to. So the importance of kind of pre and post monitoring of sites really helps to demonstrate the effectiveness of some of these solutions as well. So this first example here, this was a development of a new business park in the north of England. And during the development stage of the scheme, it was identified that the site was home to populations of great crested newts. So following initial site surveys, so working in conjunction with ecologists and engineers together, locations were selected for 2 climate tunnels, so 2 amphibian tunnel crossing points to kind of cover the known migration routes of the amphibians as well, so as not to disturb their routes and say provide them with permanent road crossing features as well. The tunnels themselves were also utilised in conjunction with guide fencing. So you can see in the top right-hand image there, you can see the green fencing in the background there, and also shown in the bottom left image as well. So directing them to the relevant crossing points and say providing them with means to prevent them actually getting onto the road itself. In this particular instance, the 2 tunnels were employed and installed flush with the road surface. So you can hopefully see that in the bottom right-hand image there. You can see the one tunnel closer and the other one just in the background there as well. So it has that benefit, all those benefits that I mentioned before in terms of being flush with the road surface, so encouraging their use, giving that nice moist environment and letting the light into it as well. So to say, it's important to understand that what we're installing is actually doing the job it's intended to. So once the development was completed, the local authority in conjunction with FrogLife, who are a national amphibian conservation organisation, monitored the tunnels with extremely encouraging results. So over 5 years of monitoring, a range of different species of amphibians were recorded moving through the tunnels, well over 600 great crested newts, smooth newts, frogs and toads also employed within that as well. There was also population modelling undertaken of the surrounding ponds, which also showed a significant increase in population sizes during the monitoring period as well. So as I say, really demonstrating the effectiveness of the solutions and understanding how they're working, that they are working effectively. This is a site up in Scotland, Perth and Kinross, where local wildlife rangers had reported really high numbers of amphibians being observed and trapped in roadside gully pots. So throughout a 2 to 3 year period, they surveyed large numbers of amphibians they found within the pots, and with over 600 gully pots checked, 50% of them were found to contain amphibians within them. They were checked regularly, which involved a visual check within them and also a search within the gully pots themselves in terms of long-handled nets. And you can see some examples of what was seen and observed within the gullies. So what was employed here was a solution that I talked about a few slides back, was wildlife curbs in conjunction with escape ladders in the gullies as well. So one as a preventative and one as means of providing that escape for them. So again, post-installation monitoring the site was undertaken with really encouraging results. And the initial surveys showed that animals and amphibians trapped within the gully pots was reduced by well over half. So really encouraging to see. Obviously, still undertaking this monitoring can help us to understand where there's still residual impacts and things that we can still maybe do further to address and help to improve further as well. This is a site in Wokingham. This was installed in the last couple of years or so. It's basically a new road to connect to a new housing development estate from the wider road network. And this is a really great example where biodiversity was considered right from the outset. So as part of the development, it saw landscaping of 4.5 hectare open space with a number of features such as eco ponds within that to help encourage wildlife. So designed to attract things like crested newts, dragonflies, damselflies and grass snakes. Also had mammals on the site, so otters and a variety of birds as well. So things like natural habitats like ponds and various planting of the habitats as well as 2 tunnels, one as a buried tunnel under the road itself and one across one of the access ways, a slotted top one at the surface, linked together with guide walls as well to direct them to the relevant crossing points, and other solutions as well. This also employed the kind of gully mitigation measures that I've spoken about, and also there's a culvert under this scheme, so it also had mammal ledges on the culvert as well, so to enable mammals to traverse through the culvert as well. Also things like bird boxes and bat boxes as well. So as I say, a real kind of wealth of different types of solutions there. So I went to site just after the measures were installed, just to take a few photos. As I say, it's quite early days in terms of the site, so the vegetation hasn't had a chance yet to kind of grow and build up over the coming months and years. It's going to be a real haven for wildlife using that site as well. And then last example here, this was another site up in Scotland, Frankfield Loch. It was part of a wetland park, so it consisted of a large area of woodland, reed beds and marshland. So basically the site is a real excellent wildlife habitat supporting a range of different species, including a number of amphibians as well. So new housing development was designed and proposed for the site, as kind of shown on the image here, and that sort of dotted outline there. The connecting road from the main road to the housing development, kind of cutting across the area between the marshland and the loch, so part of the route of where a number of the amphibians were migrating to and from. So again, engineers and ecologists working together to kind of come up with a solution here. And what was proposed here was 3 crossing points for amphibians, kind of as shown on the map there, 1, 2 and 3, designed and spaced, so over 100-metre section, 50 metres apart for each one, and then also connected with guide fencing as well, which extended around 50 metres beyond the tunnels as well, so providing as wider catchment area as possible to direct the amphibians accordingly and allow them to cross between the loch and the marshland as well. Again, monitoring the site was undertaken, custom built cameras installed in the tunnels. I put a summary of the results shown on there, but again, it was some really encouraging results around there. And the results are showing that the tunnels, again, well used by local species of amphibians, and that kind of combination of tunnels and guide fencing as well. So in that photo, you can see the tunnel up the road surface, and then just to the right of that, you can also see the guide fencing directing to that as well. So preventing them from getting onto the road, providing that means of crossing as well. So, and I've said about the importance of monitoring to understand sites and solutions are working effectively. One thing that kind of ACO have been working on and developed is our Habitat Matters campaign and mapping system. So basically, it's an initiative to help the UK construction sector and the public to understand that relationship between humans, infrastructure, and the environment around us. So what we did, we developed the Habitat Matters mapping system. So it's a free tool, and we worked with biological mapping specialists to create this tool. Basically, it allows you to replicate your site. So what I've done in this example here, this is one of those case study examples I showed you, that site in Wokingham, where we've replicated the site. We've shown the mitigation measures, so things like the tunnels, the culverts, the ponds, all those measures in there, the bird boxes and bat boxes on the site. And what that does, it generates a QR code for that specific site. And we worked in conjunction with the local authority for this site and created a sign that's been placed on the site with that QR code. And what that does is, so for anyone kind of walking in that area, if they see or observe any wildlife using it, they can just scan the QR code and make a log of that, a record of it. So any observations of wildlife, and that feeds into national biological record keeping. So it's a really good tool to kind of help engage local communities for local authorities and highway authorities. Also helps to promote and show that the work that they've been doing to help wildlife to encourage and prosper. As I say, getting that community engagement as well can enable us to get a really good picture and understand how these sorts of solutions are working, where they're working well, and where they're kind of improving and say really helping wildlife and biodiversity to grow and prosper. So pretty much it in terms of my slides. I've got one last slide to come. It's a short 30-second video clip just of a number of wildlife tunnels that have been kind of used. Not all UK based. There's some different species of animals there. Interesting to see if you can spot and tell the animals. But as I say, it's really nice to see these solutions in action and how they work. So as I say, I'll just pop that up and say it's about 30 seconds or so. So that's it in terms of the slides.
Harry, thanks very much. That was absolutely fascinating. I love that little video at the end. I don't see any questions in the Q&A. I've got a couple of my own, though, inevitably.
Okay.
You talked a lot about national highways, and if we think about the sort of, I like that little slide with the 4 boxes with the fragmentation and mitigation and all of those things. So if we're going to prevent this fragmentation, there needs to be demand from clients to do it, because presumably there's a lot of ecological surveys needed and work needed to be done. And of course, national highways look after the strategic road network, but the rest of our roads are looked after by local authorities. And, you know, the common perception, certainly where I live, is that they can't even fill the potholes, let alone, you know, because they're stretched, these organisations, for budget and time. How demanding are clients around this, and how much difference will the legislation make to them?
I think it's a really good question. And because I worked in local authority highways for around 10 years or so prior to where I am now, really kind of, as you say, often there's a struggle to kind of do the basics in terms of keeping the road network going, filling potholes and things like that. So I think the legislation will certainly help, certainly for new schemes coming through. Obviously, we've got quite an advanced infrastructure in place, so lots of roads and things around it already. And I am sort of seeing some really encouraging kind of input from local authorities in particular, and really want to kind of enhance the network. Budgets are a constraint, and I think they always will be. I think that's one of the biggest challenges. But some of those examples that I showed, I think most of the examples that I showed are aware local authorities. And some I think we're kind of seeing more than others, but certainly encouraging to see these things coming through. And it's not these wildlife mitigation measures, a lot of them aren't new. So we've been making the kind of the tunnels and things for well over 30 years. And interestingly, I think it's interesting that the UK's first towed tunnel I think it was installed in 1987, just outside Henley-on-Thames. And I happened to find it on Google Street View the other day, and it's still there. It's still going strong. I want to go to the site and see, because I'm hoping it's being maintained and used as well. I think that sort of over the 20 or 30 years, it was quite initially it was quite an unusual thing to see, But certainly from the experience I've seen in the last 2 or 3 years, starting to see it more and more with local authorities in particular. So I'm hoping that it's kind of going to encourage and grow. But as you rightly say, that big challenge is finance. And it's not just the installation, obviously thinking about maintenance and monitoring as well, which is key.
Maintenance leads us on to a question in the chat about these tunnels in particular.
Yep.
Do they require a lot of maintenance, and are they maintained?
They do require maintenance. It's not particularly onerous. The main thing is that they're at least inspected, ideally before, so for amphibians, ideally before the kind of migration period, or they're inspected to give enough time before the migration period. So for example, if they have become blocked or clogged, the kind of maintenance is quite straightforward. It's either, if they are kind of blocked, it's just a case of, you can either jet them by kind of using sort of standard highway jetting equipment. You can get, basically it's like a broom on wheels that can kind of go through just to clear any vegetation and things that's built up. It's nice to have kind of a little layer of vegetation, so maybe leaves and kind of things at the bottom just for that surface, but yeah, need to be able to kind of be maintained and kept free. And for things like the guide walls and guide fence as well, it's just to make sure that they haven't become overgrown, that there's not overgrowth such that they can then climb up that vegetation and climb over the fencing as well. So the main thing is a regular inspection regime, and then, as I say, it is often quite simple maintenance if and when it is needed.
Okay, thank you. And we've got a question from Jeremy in the chat, who said he enjoyed your presentation. What does the rejection column on the slide you displayed? Does rejection indicate that species were avoiding the use of the tunnels?
Yes, in some of the instances, I think on one of them, because they were monitored with cameras, it showed them how many kind of went in and how many kind of came out. So there was a degree of rejection in terms of maybe going in and turning around and coming out, so kind of not following the path through as well. So as I say, one of the benefits, if we can, is to keep the tunnels as short as possible, and allowing them, say, if we can install them flush with the road surface to allow that light in as well. Those sorts of measures can help to improve their usage. So yeah, things like that I think are really useful to understand what's working, maybe where improvements can be made, and things like that as well. And there are more and more studies being undertaken in terms of usage of these types of tunnels. We worked with a PhD student who was studying specifically hedgehogs and their use of these sorts of tunnels. I used 1 or 2 of her video clips in the presentation, but one of the things that she found was that on sites where there's different sizes of tunnels, so obviously depending on the species, you might need larger culverts and tunnels for bigger animals, but she found where the sites had different sized tunnels, hedgehogs preferred the smaller sized tunnels, I guess, see it as less as a threat and more of a safe route through. But I think it's still quite early, a lot of the research, but there is a lot of research going on as well.
Brilliant, thank you, Terry. We've got a good question here from James Watkins. Thanks, James. Have you experienced difficult clients who try to avoid mitigation solutions in their designs? Please don't name them. We don't want to get sued.
No, I won't name them, but yes. And I have seen where people will either avoid it or, understandably, for any kind of new scheme, we said budgets are always a constraint. So something like a dedicated tunnel, the upfront cost is not particularly cheap. Obviously there is, in terms of installing and everything else like that, but it's really important to kind of make sure, if you are going to put something in, that it's fit for purpose. So I have seen options where they've looked at maybe something like a dedicated tunnel, that no, it's too expensive, and put in a kind of solution that's not actually appropriate, maybe using a wrong sort of material or the wrong size of product and things like that. So yeah, I think it's important to try and put across, if you are going to put these measures in, it's important to do it correctly and properly, otherwise they just won't work and won't achieve what you want them to achieve. But it does continue to highlight that very important challenge around budgets and costs.
Yeah, thank you. I think that probably needs to be the final question from Ms. Cooper. What impact does drainage have on tunnels during stormwater events?
That's a very good question. So I've said, particularly in terms of the tunnels where they kind of allow moisture into them, if you have got particularly or kind of roads that are subject maybe to heavier types of pollution, then also thinking about the drainage, so trying to intercept as much of the drainage from the road as possible before it gets to the tunnel. And there have been some studies undertaken as well about pollution found within the tunnels as well. So it's an important consideration. And I think, as I kind of mentioned a few times through the presentation, if engineers and ecologists kind of work together from the outset, these are the sorts of things that can be considered right from the start, and make sure that solutions are put in place that are fit for purpose. That was a very quick answer on what is actually a very complicated topic. So apologies for that.
Because I must admit, it struck me with the advent of the Environment Act and the need to, and the requirement for net gain. Is that going to lead to a shortage of ecologists? Do we have enough ecologists to do? Because obviously, there's going to be demand for more work here, and I wonder whether that will lead to a resource issue that might hold projects up.
It could well do. It's a really good observation. It's not something I've come to mind to me, but I think it could.
I mean, it tends to happen. It was the experience of the Green Deal, where all this money was available to install heat pumps, so there weren't enough people qualified to install heat pumps, and the whole thing failed. It's probably not one that you or I are going to solve, but it's an interesting kind of macroeconomic question. Given we've got this legislation, which is great. I think the legislation is doing the good thing, but actually doesn't have the resources to comply. You can see the price going up for ecologists as we speak.
Yes.
We're in the wrong profession, Terry.
Definitely, yes.
Okay, I guess I need to wrap it up there, because we're just about coming up with time. So Terry, thanks very much. I found that presentation fascinating, and
thank you.
Our audience did too. We've got a series of these from your organisation to try and help raise people's awareness of some of these biodiversity issues. So if you're listening and watching, please take a look on the school events calendar and pick up on some of the ones that we're following up with. So thanks to Terry, and thanks to everybody else who joined us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.